Welcome back to the Ramsay Centre's online lecture series, turning to a theme very close to the heart of our mission at this centre, namely university degrees, especially in the humanities, the part they play or should play in teaching our young people about our civilisation, its literature, its philosophy, its art and architecture, its institutions, which I include in this list because they too are thoughtful constructions, forms assembled bit by bit over the centuries, like ancient cathedrals. And then, finally, as in the fascinating talk we're about to hear, it's music. Let's call all these things, these artefacts, let's call them our civilisation's forms of thought. Now, an important thing about all these forms of thought is that they're at one and the same time very familiar and quite unfamiliar. They have made us what we are. They are everywhere around us: buildings, books, democratic institutions, artworks and murals, music in the lift. But it's so easy to take them for granted, and yet so hard to understand them properly, for themselves, in their own terms, with their own long histories and strange evolutions, out of forms we might not recognise at all, into those that we recognise very well. So it's hard to really attend to them, learn their languages, not just glance at them or dismiss them in the shallow terms of our current obsessions and prejudices and fashionable opinions. Now, if we don't, or at least some of us don't, learn how those forms of thought have informed us, shaped us, if we don't learn to think critically about ourselves by realising how they thought critically about their own societies, that's to say, if we don't learn to use the true criticism, the true judgment, which those forms of thought can teach us in all their complex and long-developing structures, then everything we think about our culture, not just its books, its art, its music, but its institutions, its practices, its values, will have no roots, will just be the shallow, uninformed expression of immediate preferences. As our speaker today puts it, just fashion choices. Now, close to 50% of our young people now go to university, but to do what? Most will be studying for professional careers, which is of course entirely right and proper, what universities have always done. But how many will still choose to study these foundational forms of thought, especially if it costs them more to do so? And when they do make that choice, on the other side of the transaction, how many universities are still able or willing to fund and offer such courses of study? And furthermore, and this is harder, how many are willing to set an example by offering the courses without the filtering lenses of just those current obsessions and fashionable opinions that the students already have? The universities bear a huge responsibility of cultural or civilisational transmission, and if they don't discharge that responsibility, no one will. And if no one does, well, we will just lose all that thinking, the rich awareness of all we are and have been and can be. Now, this loss, or the spectre of it, is what is worrying our speaker today. Professor Peter Tregear is an eminent musician and musicologist. He's a principal fellow of the Melbourne Conservatorium of Music and an adjunct professor of music at the University of Adelaide. For 6 years, he was Fellow of Music at Fitzwilliam College, Cambridge, and Director of Music at Fitzwilliam and Churchill Colleges. Since then, he's been Director of Academic Studies at Royal Holloway College at the University of London, Professor and Head of the School of Music at the Australian National University in Canberra, and the Executive Director of the Academy of Performing Arts at Monash University. Peter was Dean of Trinity College, Melbourne from 2006 to 2008, Dean of St Mark's College in Adelaide during last year, and he is this year taking up the position of Inaugural Director of Little Hall, a landmark student residential facility at the University of Melbourne. On the academic side, Professor Tregear has a particular interest in the musical culture of the Weimar Republic. He's the author of Ernst Krenek and the Politics of Musical Style, and in 2019, to international acclaim, he conducted the Australian premiere of Krenek's opera Johnny spielt auf in Melbourne. Peter Tregear was awarded the Medal of the Order of Australia in last year's Australia Day Honours List. We are very lucky to have him as our distinguished speaker on this occasion, and his title is A Matter of Some Notes, or Why We Should Still Study Classical Music in Australia.
It is an honour to be asked to give this lecture for the Ramsay Centre and its endeavour to support the continuing study of and inquiry into the patterns of Western civilisation in Australia. And that endeavour now feels more urgent than ever. Post-COVID changes to the Australian higher education fee system passed by the Australian Parliament in October 2020 now lay out clear financial incentives for students to change their degree preferences at university from areas such as the creative arts and humanities towards one with which the government believes have better job outcomes. And the underlying message the government seems to be sending the nation is, I think, clear. Universities should be, it seems, focused exclusively on providing job-ready graduates for the Australian economy and not also producing what we might like to think of as independent-minded, culturally literate and critically thinking ones. And one of the first disciplinary areas to be directly impacted by these changes has been my own, music. Around the same time the government changes were foreshadowed, Monash University announced that it was disestablishing its musicology and ethnomusicology specialisations in its School of Music. And yet, that same school's website was also proclaiming, and indeed, as I deliver this lecture, it still does, that these areas of study exist, in fact, to empower students to be able to consider the big questions such as, why does music matter? And how do understandings of music differ across time, place and culture? What then are we to make of a university humanities department that no longer believes that such questions are important for its students? One thing surely is that we can now decisively move beyond the always lazy idea that a philanthropic initiative like the Ramsay Centre was somehow in lockstep with right-wing culture or politics. Its endeavours in supporting areas of the humanities, teaching and research, like music, in the face of current and indeed recent government policy, and indeed, sadly, the acquiescence of many of our universities, is looking more and more to be, to quote a recent blog by director Professor Simon Haynes, not just a lifeline for the humanities, but the whole darn lifeboat. Now, we might think that a degree in music at a university is firstly about training musicians, to be performers particularly. But university degree courses in music have musicological subjects at the core because it has also been assumed that music graduates should not just be good at playing their instruments or singers and so forth, but also historians, analysers, critics and explorers of the musical culture that they inhabited. Musicians should be able to understand their chosen art form in its broader historical and cultural context. The ultimate aim of the study of music at university, as one would think it is for any aspect of Western culture, is furthermore not blindly to support it. Rather, it is to support critical thinking about it, if not indeed the art of critical thinking itself. To this end, the cultivation of historical perspectives within the study of music is critical. As David Armitage and Joe Gouldy recently argued in an essay for the journal Aeon, the humanities departments of our universities should be the place to go for a long look in the rear view mirror. The mission of the humanities is to transmit questions about value and to question values by testing traditions that build up over centuries and millennia. The discipline of musicology helps enable students to contextualise, interpret and analyse, indeed, a millennia's worth of Western musical culture. Disengage with that and the prospect, instead of a kind of postmodern dystopia with what remains is just an endless flow of the music of now, if you kind of imagine a sort of post-modern shopping mall of styles that we can browse divorced from their historical context or indeed content, that kind of dystopia, I think, starts to loom real. And this was a condition that the German philosopher and music critic Theodor Adorno once described as the spectre of man without memory, without the ability to recall or dream things that could be currently other than what they are. Now, the Monash Music School trumpets its post-COVID subject offerings now as aiming to, quote, develop the musicians of tomorrow for a progressive approach to teaching and research. But without historical musicology at its core, how else can we describe that decision to remove musicology from the core of its curriculum as anything else but a kind of institutional forgetting? And one thing I would argue then is that one thing it is not is progressive. Because this is happening at a time when music has arguably never been more present in our lives, whether that be through streaming services or through piped music in stores, shopping centres, sporting arenas and such like. Music is, indeed, arguably the most ubiquitous, or for any of us who take, say, for instance, public transport regularly will know, the most unavoidable of art forms. Our sonic lives are increasingly approaching, I like to think, the condition of the film or TV soundtrack. And therefore, there really should be no need for special pleading for our universities to maintain a place for the critical examination of our musical culture and its origins. Indeed, to ask, what does all this music mean, and what purpose and whose interests does it serve? To be sure, though, this is not an easy thing to do. That quip attributed to Frank Zappa that writing about music is like dancing about architecture has more than a little basis in truth. Good critical writing about music, however, can, among other things, prompt us to reflect on the quality, or otherwise, of that experience, provide us with a historical context, and help us draw our attention to the kinds of formal, social, political, and aesthetic content that such music might have. And this in turn takes training. It takes also experience and the cultivation of specific listening sensibilities. But without such training, what remains is the privilege, I think, ultimately of simply a personal experience over the possibility of what we might like to think more broadly as shared cultural knowledge. Some aspects of scholarly practice in the humanities now actively encourage such a limited view. A now well-established postmodern perspective, for instance, would assert that any value judgment we might make about a piece of music is ultimately no more than the covert association of our own position of power or privilege. It follows, therefore, that there is no innate value to be found in a particular aesthetic experience, or in this case particularly a musical work. What we take to be a good or bad work of music is, rather, just the externalised expression of our own prejudices and tastes, and a reflection of the identity group with which we might choose to belong. Debates about musical value thus can be deflected away from engagements with musical substance altogether, and instead reduced down to explorations of how music might help project aspects of our character, or our sexual preference, economic status, or indeed economic and educational achievements. Rarely, if ever, are such encounters valued then for how they might help us access imaginative worlds that are actually different from the ones that we commonly inhabit. Whether those imaginative worlds are from the past or from foreign countries, or Pache L.P. Hartley, in this case the past is indeed a kind of foreign country. The acquisition of novel musical experiences is instead increasingly valued in our culture, not as a mean to deepen a capacity to contemplate the organisation of sound per se and the multiple ways that that can be done, but like our fashion choices, just one other way in which we can express an attitude towards or an allegiance within certain groups within society. And no wonder then it is, with just a few notable exceptions, that newspapers right across the Anglosphere have jettisoned specialist classical music critics. Reviews of classical music concerts or opera that still appear in our daily newspapers are now, if we are brutally honest, little more than just court reports, giving enough column space to enable the critic to let us know who performed what, where and how, but no longer really able to engage us in the much more important question of why. To be sure, our group identity unquestionably shapes and can limit the kinds of engagement we can have with musical culture, as indeed with all culture. But I would argue it should not become the only foundation upon which we choose to build our understandings of music. And here, universities should be defending the continuing validity of rational systems of aesthetic inquiry and judgment, if not the continuing possibility of ideas such as objective beauty and objective truth, and not simply promoting narrow forms of knowing that would instead give primacy to our lived experience without full critical interrogation. And it's worth considering at this point that music was in fact one of the original areas of study for a university. It formed part of a group of 4 liberal arts subjects, known as the quadrivium, along with arithmetic, geometry and astronomy. Music claimed such an exalted place in the medieval European university curriculum because, according to one strand of ancient Greek natural philosophy, it had an especially deep connection to the natural world. It was claimed, for instance, that the numeric ratios found to govern the combination of notes that we find agreeable to our ears were mirrored, so to speak, in the motion of the planets. Thus, the opening stanza of John Dryden's A Song for St. Cecilia's Day of 1687 exclaims, From heavenly harmony, this universal frame began, when nature underneath a heap of jarring atoms lay and could not heave her head. The tuneful voice was heard on high, Arise, ye more than dead. Then cold and hot and moist and dry, in order to their stations leap, and music's power obey. By Dryden's time, of course, the Copernican revolution and Newtonian physics offered a less, tuneful version of how the universe works. The lingering influence of classical antiquity on Western musical culture, however, was soon to be felt in other and perhaps more profound ways. And here, I'm constantly amazed how few musicians, let alone non-musicians, know when asked what the qualifier classical in classical music refers to. I suspect it is considered merely nowadays to be a genre label, and increasingly a marginalised one at that, for software like iTunes and other digital platforms. The word classical has been, it seems, in this context at least, stripped of any substantial historical or aesthetic meaning. Now, to be sure, the music we label classical bears absolutely no resemblance to what we believe was the actual music performed in ancient Greece and Rome, of which, alas, scant evidence survives. But it is no mere coincidence the very idea of a classical music arose in Western Europe at the same time that European archaeologists and art historians were rediscovering and promoting other aspects of Greek and Roman culture. The sculpture, architecture and frescoes they discovered seemed to exemplify what the German archaeologist and art historian Johann Joachim Winckelmann would famously surmise as qualities of noble simplicity, balance, order, and refinement. And that time, which roughly corresponds to the years between the death of J.S. Bach in 1750 and the death of Beethoven in 1827, is also, incidentally, known as the classical period in classical music history, as if to double down on the association with the perceived authority of the classical past. And this association was more than merely aesthetic. It was also related to broader philosophical and political movements at the time that were promoting then new and novel ideas about the innate freedom and autonomy of the post-feudal citizen. Here, Roman Republic and Athenian democratic political models influenced, among others, the drafters of the American and French revolutionary constitutions. And it is not just a sop to then current architectural taste that the White House, for instance, looks like it does, a remodelled classical temple. But in places like Germany, which indeed did not even exist as a nation state at this time, however, such political ideas found their most potent expression in the art itself. For the generation of German romantics, people like Friedrich Schiller, for instance, and this is a quote from Schiller, "True art does not aim merely at transitory entertainment. It has a serious purpose, not to translate man into a momentary dream of freedom, but to make him really and truly free." By inviting us to experience a realm that exists outside our everyday central world, which, as Schiller continued, otherwise oppresses us as crude raw material and weighs upon us as a blind force, we are, it was believed, enabled then to pursue what he concluded was the mastery over matter through ideas. That is, we are not trapped by the circumstances of our own birth or our nationality or so on, only by the limits of our imagination. And music became the ideal expressive medium for this new age of self-realisation. For, unlike the other literary and plastic arts, it did not mimic ordinary sensory or cognitive experience, or offer a stable code of signifiers that could be analysed simply or with any precision. Now, not all music works in this way or is susceptible to be received in this way, but much of what is still described as classical music today, however, does. And it does so because it self-consciously foregrounds heightened levels of internal musical coherence. Through an engagement with this music's own internal logic, which reached, unparalleled levels of complexity at this time, we were, and indeed still are, invited to enter a sonically inscribed imaginative realm radically removed from our revealed selves. As the music self-realises as it likes, so we as a listener are invited to do the same. And ultimately this is because of the effectiveness of Western music notation, the capacity to write music down in particularly effective ways that allows composers then to indeed develop musical forms of particular complexity, and also to engage in a kind of dialogue with their own history of their own musical form. In other words, composers already and certainly by the time of Beethoven and so on, were very conscious of the music that had been written 10, 20, 30, and even 100, and sometimes even centuries before them, and could then use their art to comment on that history. Moreover, the sonic world that they were developing was by its very nature, of course, as all music is, dynamic. It changes through time, and as such was considered to draw the attention of the listener to the dynamics of historical change more broadly. Now, I suspect it's fair to say that we in Australia, by and large, have not been so keen to listen to, let alone think about music in this way. Such music is rather, like I suspect and most of us imagine classical music itself, is something that happens to other people. And indeed, early in his book, Australian Music, Themes of a New Society, the late Australian music historian Roger Cavell noted that the establishment of a colony at Sydney Cove in 1788 coincided in time with the full pride of the German classical music tradition. But for him, this was no fortunate historical synchronicity. Rather, the preeminence of that tradition was one of the causal factors, he believed, that resulted in a colonial Australia being essentially deaf to the music of Aboriginal Australia, as well to the sounds of our own native fauna. As a result, he argues, unambiguously authentic Australian music, although I must confess he doesn't really define exactly what such music would be, nevertheless, he argues, could not and did not emerge until the latter half of the 20th century. And certainly for the sort of reasons that he outlines, some of my academic colleagues, I think, would see that the current COVID-enhanced decline of interest in and support for Western classical music and the study of Western classical music in Australia at the moment as, in fact, if anything, a necessary corrective. For them, the aesthetic value we might have once ascribed to such music was really ultimately just a cover for its true function as a marker of class status and power, and as a cultural tool in the service of many, well, if we might say, the less appealing aspects of Western civilization itself. From the perspective of their newly decolonised curricula, the coincident triumph of popular musical culture is, therefore, merely delivering a relegation of classical musical culture that we might otherwise wish to have seen anyway for these kinds of progressive political reasons. But to my mind, it remains an undeniable historical truth that the peculiar qualities of Western classical music have and nevertheless enabled musical ideas of a certain and particular complexity and scale not only to be conceived, but as I was saying, to be preserved for others to discover, emulate and build upon. And music educators surely do not need to become unthinking cheerleaders, whether explicitly or implicitly, for Western culture writ large, to be able to recognise and evaluate such innately musical aspects of Western musical culture. And when they do, I believe, inevitably the spectre of aesthetic judgment returns. For as the 20th century German musicologist Karl Dahlhaus once noted, musical greatness is not independent of the external scope and format of works. It is in some respects made possible by them. To take one example, the principal means of large-scale musical organisation in Austro-German music in the early 19th century, what is known as sonata form, is also what we might describe as a progressive form par excellence, a kind of Bildungsroman in sound, that enabled composers to develop a complex form of musical narrative that can be both self-justifying in terms of its internal musical processes, but also in dialogue with its own history. And understanding such formal complexity is not just the key to gaining more in-depth and enriching engagement with the music itself, which I would, of course, see as a worthwhile aim in and of itself. It's also the key to appreciating the full implication of statements such as this, again by Theodor Adorno, and here he is talking about Beethoven. And he says, if we listen to Beethoven and do not hear anything of the revolutionary bourgeoisie, we understand Beethoven no better than does one who cannot follow the purely musical content of his pieces, the inner history that happens to their themes. The dynamic musical process that Adorno heard in Beethoven's music was, indeed, he believed, a reflection of the dynamic historical processes of Beethoven's time, no less. In happier circumstances, we were supposed to be marking this year the 250th anniversary of the birth of Ludwig van Beethoven. And that could have presented an opportunity for at least some of the public conversation in this country around the composer to move beyond the otherwise romanticised pop cultural cliches, to consider the value of his music in precisely such terms. Arguably, it is the mesmerising intricacy of Beethoven's musical constructions, his way of building large-scale sonic constructions out of the obsessive development of court musical motifs, which ultimately demands from us a kind of mode of engaged listening. But as one of Beethoven's greatest living interpreters, the pianist and conductor Daniel Barenboim has recently exclaimed in an interview for The Guardian, we are getting further and further away from being able to recognise the inherently musical significance of his music. Instead, he concluded, our unfamiliarity seems to breed contempt. And indeed, we are now seeing the emergence of a chorus of critics who would prefer to cancel his music. As two United States critics put it in September, it was, quote, wealthy white men who embraced Beethoven and turned his symphony, in this case his Symphony No. 5, into a symbol of superiority and importance, their superiority and importance. For some in other groups, and they list women, LGBTQ plus people of colour, works like Beethoven's Fifth Symphony may be predominantly a reminder of classical music's history of exclusion and elitism. Now, apart from wondering whether they've actually really listened to the music, I also find myself asking what kinds of music are really serving the powerful these days. It's certainly been a long while since I've been buttonholed by traditional classical music in, say, my local supermarket, cafe, or sporting arena. Or, as the Times music critic Richard Morrison recently observed, the idea that classical music somehow embodies class does not stand up to even cursory analysis. He wrote, "Are the symphonies of Elgar, the son of a Worcester shopkeeper, more middle class than the pop songs of Jess Glynn, the daughter of a Muswell Hill estate agent?" he asked. Rather, I think, as the New Yorker's music critic Alex Ross recently wrote, wouldn't it be more accurate for us to observe that popular musical culture is really today's hegemonic musical presence? He suggested, meanwhile, that forms of classical music are, quote, kicked to the margins, their demographics undesirable, their lifestyles uncool, their formal intricacies ill-suited to the transmission networks of the digital age. The old hierarchy of high and low, he concludes, has become a sham. Pop is the ruling party. Now, to be sure, the fact that classical music is a field and repertory dominated by, or by no means exclusive to, dead white Western European male composers is not a historical fact that we should shirk from. And according to Peggy McIntosh's now famous 1988 essay on white privilege, to be able to say that people of my colour made it what it is when being introduced to Western civilization's supposedly greatest achievements is a foundational aspect of such privilege, in her view. But neither should that fact become the determinative criterion of musical value. As the American author and journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates observed in relation to his encounter with the white American literary canon, when you are a young intellectual black kid, you often find yourself in a desperate search for some sort of anti-Western tradition. That Saul Bellow quote, "Who is the Tolstoy of the Zulus?" really captures a lot of the dilemma for us who are looking for a native tradition. And that search ends all kinds of ways for different people. But for us, I think it ended in the rejection of the premise in the great Ralph Wiley riposte that Tolstoy is the Tolstoy of the Zulus. That line was sorcery for me. It found me, a black pathologist, and set me free by revealing that my own search for something native was an implicit acceptance of the very racism that I sought to counter. The way out was not to find my own, but to reject the notion of anybody's own. If you reject the very premises of racism, the idea that skin colour directly contributes to genius or sloth, then all of humanity becomes native to you. And so empowered, I could, out of my own individual identity, create my own intellectual and artistic pedigree. And I was free to have it extend from Biggie to Wharton, to Melville to Robert Hayden. The sad truth is that we are now less and less likely to hear a university professor of music or a director of one of our classical music institutions, let alone an arts minister, in those government realms where such a ministerial portfolio still exists, be prepared to make such a naked claim for classical music's value. Rather, I think the struggle for this music's ongoing relevance to contemporary Australia must now be won, I think, on a wider battlefield of ideas. And this gives us who still work in the classical music industry, whether as educators or performers, both the opportunity and indeed the necessity to start making tectonic shifts in how the value of this music might be articulated to those who lie outside our circles of self-interest. And the underlying case we should be pressing is that great music in all its forms, in all its genres, wherever it is found, and however it is ultimately labelled by us, should properly be understood, like all other positive aspects of a mature, egalitarian society, belonging to, speaking for, and challenging each and every one of us. Thank you.
Well, apart from all the other remarkable insights in that talk, it's very good to have had a chance to mark Beethoven's 250th birthday, December the 16th, if I remember. What Peter Tregear has had to say about this art form surely goes also for the other Western forms of thought I mentioned at the beginning, how critical it is to articulate their value not just to ourselves and to each new generation, but as Peter Tregear says, to those who lie outside our own circles of self-interest. And wasn't that a terrific message from Ta-Nehisi Coates about Tolstoy? I hope, in fact I'm sure, you enjoyed the talk as much as I did. On behalf of the Centre and our audience, warm thanks to Professor Peter Tregear for this wonderful lecture. And to everyone else, do please join us again soon. This is Simon Haynes at the Ramsay Centre saying goodbye for now.